The house had been quiet for weeks. Too quiet. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the groan of the wind through the half-open window, reminded David Turner of what he'd lost. He used to come home to laughter, to his daughter Emily calling out, "Dad, you're late again?" Now there was only silence, thick and unbearable, pressing against him from all sides. Her bedroom door was still slightly ajar, the way she always left it, and he hadn't touched a thing inside since the night she was taken. It had been a Saturday, one of those easy evenings where the world seemed calm, harmless even. Emily was 17, bright, stubborn, and endlessly kind. She'd gone to the lake with her friends. David remembered the way she smiled before she left, hair tied back, camera slung over her shoulder, promising to be home before dark. But she never made it back. The police found her car on the side of the road the next morning, keys still in the ignition, her phone on the passenger seat. What followed was a blur of flashing lights, questions, and sterile rooms that smelled like coffee and despair. Days turned into weeks, and when they finally found her body, buried shallow in the woods off County Road 6, the investigation had already begun to cool. "We're doing everything we can," Detective Marsh had told him, his eyes tired, rehearsed. But David could see it in their faces. She was becoming another case file, another tragedy destined for the cold case shelf. He didn't sleep much after that. Grief is a strange thing. It starts as pain, but if left too long, it hardens into something else. Something sharper. The night he overheard two officers joking about some drifter probably did it, something inside him broke. He knew, in that moment, that he couldn't just wait. He had to act. The first thing he did was buy a map of the county. He circled the lake, the road, the patch of forest where she'd been found. He spent hours at diners and gas stations, talking to people who didn't want to talk. He printed missing person flyers even after she'd been buried, just to keep her face alive in the world. And slowly, painfully, he started piecing things together that the police had ignored. There was a man. His name was Richard Calloway. He'd worked maintenance at the high school for a few months, then disappeared right after Emily's death. No one had noticed, no one cared. But David found his old address through an old pay stub Emily's friend remembered seeing. It was enough of a lead to keep him moving. David followed him across 3 states. Each motel room felt the same, cheap wallpaper, flickering lights, the steady hum of his obsession. He learned to track receipts, trace credit card transactions, talk his way into information. And every night, he'd sit on the edge of a stranger's bed, looking at Emily's photo, whispering, "Almost there, kiddo." When he finally found Calloway, it was in a small town outside Tulsa. The man had a new name, a new job, and a woman who had no idea who she was living with. David watched him for days from across the street, learning his patterns. The rage that had once burned wild inside him became something colder, steadier, like a blade being honed. One evening, when the sun dipped below the rooftops and shadows began to stretch across the street, David made his move. He followed Calloway to a rundown bar on the edge of town. He waited until he came out, half-drunk, keys fumbling in his hand. Then David stepped out from the alley. "Richard," he said quietly. The man froze. His eyes darted toward the voice, confusion giving way to recognition. "Do I know you?" David took another step forward. The streetlight above them flickered, bathing them both in pale orange. "You knew my daughter," he said. There was a long silence, the kind that feels like it's holding its breath. Then Calloway's lips twitched into a smirk, the kind that only monsters wear when they think they've escaped consequence. That smirk was all David needed. What happened next was quick, almost wordless. A struggle, a flash of metal, the sound of rain starting to fall. By the time David was done, the man was lying still on the pavement, the smirk gone forever. David stood there for a long while, breathing hard, rain washing the blood from his hands. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction, just emptiness, a vast hollow where grief used to live. Somewhere far away, a siren began to wail. When they found him, he didn't resist. He didn't try to explain. He just sat on the curb, soaked and silent, clutching Emily's photo against his chest. The officers shouted, guns drawn, but he didn't even look up. He had already done what he came to do. Months later, in a small prison cell with a window that barely let the light in, David often thought of her. Of the sound of her laughter, the smell of her shampoo, the way she used to tease him for burning breakfast every Sunday. He didn't regret what he'd done, not for a second. Because justice, he realized, wasn't always something given. Sometimes it had to be taken. And though the world would never understand, in that cold and narrow cell, for the first time since Emily died, David Turner finally slept. The nights in prison were long, but for David Turner, time had lost all meaning. The world outside moved on. Seasons changed, people forgot, and the memory of his daughter's smile began to fade from the news and from the minds of those who had once claimed to care. But for David, she never left. Every breath he took was still filled with her. Every dream was haunted by the echo of her voice. He could still hear her calling him Dad in that light, teasing tone that only she had. Sometimes he would wake up thinking she was still alive, that the nightmare had ended, and he'd find her in the kitchen, pouring coffee and humming to some song on the radio. But then reality would settle in like a cold weight on his chest, reminding him where he was. The walls were gray, the air smelled of disinfectant, and his hands, those same hands that had once lifted her high into the air when she was a little girl, were now scarred reminders of what vengeance had turned him into. There were whispers about him in the yard. "That's the guy who killed his daughter's murderer," they said. Some of the inmates respected him for it. Others avoided him. But no one challenged him. There was something in his eyes, not rage, not madness, but a kind of quiet finality, as if he had already seen the worst the world could offer and found nothing left to fear. The warden, a hard man who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, once stopped by his cell. "You know, Turner," he said, "most men in here claim they didn't do it. You're the only one who never said a word." David had looked up, his face calm. "That's because I did," he replied softly. "And I'd do it again." The warden didn't respond. He just nodded once and walked away. Years passed, and letters began to arrive. Small, careful words from strangers who had seen his story on the news or read about it online. Some called him a murderer. Others called him a hero. A few said he was what every father would be if pushed far enough. David never answered any of them. He didn't need their judgment or their praise. He had done what love demanded of him, and he carried both the burden and the peace that came with it. Every Sunday, he sat by the small window in his cell and looked toward the distant hills beyond the prison fence. He imagined Emily there, barefoot in the grass, laughing the way she used to when she tried to chase the wind. He talked to her quietly, under his breath, as if she were just outside the glass. "Hey, kiddo," he'd whisper. "I miss you. I hope it's beautiful where you are." Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, he could swear he heard her laugh again. One day, about 12 years into his sentence, a young reporter came to visit. She was nervous, clutching her notebook like a shield. "Mr. Turner," she began, "if you could go back, before it all happened, would you do anything differently?" David thought about that for a long time. He thought about Emily's laughter, her kindness, her innocence. He thought about the man who had taken all that away. He thought about the police who had given up, the system that had failed her. Then he looked at the reporter and shook his head. "No," he said, "because a father's love doesn't stop at justice. It becomes it." The reporter stared at him, unable to find words. She left quietly, and the story she later wrote painted him not as a monster or a martyr, but as a man trapped between love and law, a man who had chosen love, even when it destroyed him. When David finally got out, he was an old man. The world outside had changed. Cars looked different, music sounded strange, and the city had forgotten his name. But when he walked past the old park where he used to take Emily on Sundays, he stopped. The swings creaked softly in the wind, just as they always had. He sat on the nearest bench and closed his eyes. For a moment, he could almost see her again, her hair blowing in the wind, her sneakers kicking up dust as she laughed and called out, "Higher, Dad. Higher." David smiled, a tired, broken, peaceful smile. The years had taken everything from him, but they couldn't take that memory. It was his forever, his proof that love, even when it turns to fury, never truly dies. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, David Turner leaned back, letting the light wash over him. And for the first time since that terrible night so many years ago, he felt no anger, no pain, only the quiet warmth of knowing that somewhere, somehow, his daughter was free. And now so was he. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet for a man who had spent over a decade behind concrete walls and steel doors. Freedom, David Turner realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it crept in gently, like sunlight through a window you'd forgotten how to open. But the world he stepped back into was not the one he remembered. The streets were busier, colder somehow. People no longer looked one another in the eye. Everyone moved quickly, buried in their screens, chasing something that never seemed to stop running. David wasn't chasing anymore. He'd already caught what he'd been after: vengeance, truth, closure, whatever word people used to make sense of the darkness. Now, he just wanted quiet. He rented a small cabin at the edge of town, near the woods where the world fell silent except for the wind and the river. He built a small garden, the way Emily had once wanted, planting wildflowers she loved: lavender, daisies, sunflowers. Every morning he'd water them and whisper a few words to her memory. He didn't know if she could hear, but it didn't matter. It was his way of keeping her alive. Sometimes, he'd walk down to the lake, the same kind of place she had vanished from all those years ago, and sit there for hours, watching the light ripple across the water. The guilt still lived inside him, not for what he'd done, but for all the moments that had been stolen before that night. He thought about her 18th birthday, the college tours she never took, the first heartbreak he never got to comfort her through. All the ordinary moments that had been erased in one act of cruelty. One evening, as he sat by the water, an older man joined him on the bench. He was a fisherman, weathered and quiet, the kind of man who spoke only when words were needed. "You come here a lot," the man said, not unkindly. David nodded. "Helps me think." "Thinking can be dangerous," the man replied with a knowing smile. "You can get lost in it." "Already was," David said softly. The fisherman studied him for a while, then asked, "You lose someone?" David hesitated. He didn't like telling his story anymore. But there was something honest in the man's eyes, something that reminded him of the world before everything went wrong. "My daughter," he said finally. "A long time ago." The man nodded slowly. "Kids are a piece of your soul walking around outside you," he said. "When they go, part of you goes too." David looked out over the lake, his reflection trembling on the water's surface. "I went after the man who took her from me," he said. "Found him. Ended it." The fisherman didn't react the way most people did. No shock, no fear. Just silence, deep and thoughtful. "And did it help?" David took a long breath. "Not the way I thought it would. I thought it would fill the hole. It didn't. It just stopped it from growing." The fisherman nodded again. "Sometimes that's enough." He stood, shouldered his tackle box, and gave David one last look. "If you ever want to stop thinking so much," he said, "try fishing." Then he left. David smiled faintly at that, his first genuine smile in years. The next morning, he bought a cheap fishing rod and returned to the lake. He didn't catch much, but for once he didn't care. He wasn't there to win. He was there to be. Days turned into months, and the weight on his chest began to ease. He still talked to Emily sometimes, when the sun set or when the rain began to fall. He'd tell her about the garden, about the man at the lake, about how the stars still looked the same no matter how much the world changed. One night, he woke to the sound of thunder and rain hammering the roof. He sat by the window, watching the storm rage outside. The lightning reminded him of that night, the night everything had burned. But now, it didn't fill him with fear or anger. It felt almost like a heartbeat, a reminder that even after destruction, the world keeps moving. He thought about how Emily had always loved storms. How she'd stand by the window, counting the seconds between thunder and lightning. How she'd giggle when he'd pretend to be afraid. I'm not scared anymore, sweetheart, he whispered into the dark. You can rest now. The rain eased, and somewhere far off, the clouds began to break. A soft light touched the edge of the horizon, painting the sky in pale silver. David closed his eyes, letting the sound of the rain fade into memory. When morning came, he walked to the lake one last time. The air was cool, the world washed clean by the storm. He scattered a handful of flower petals into the water, watching them drift away. Goodbye, kiddo, he said. I'll see you soon enough. And as the petals floated out toward the center of the lake, carried gently by the current, David Turner turned away and began the long walk home, an old man, tired but finally at peace, leaving behind not vengeance or pain, but love. Because in the end, that was what his fury had always been made of. Not hate, not anger, just love, so fierce, so endless, that even death couldn't break it.